In the quiet foothills of Boulder, Colorado, a tragedy unfolded, one that had been years in the making. A woman lay unresponsive in a trailer park office, her husband frantic, pleading for help. But this was no accident. Beneath the surface of their seemingly ordinary life lurked a storm of control, jealousy, and escalating threats. Deborah DePinto had spent years fighting for her independence. But on the night of June 18, 2018, that fight came to a brutal and final end. Caught on a hidden surveillance camera, her last moments would expose the terrifying truth. A truth her husband, Scott Jones, could no longer escape. This is the chilling story of a love that turned deadly. Boulder, Colorado, a city known for its picturesque landscapes and peaceful communities, became the setting for a horrifying crime in the summer of 2018. In a small trailer park office, 44-year-old Deborah DePinto was found unresponsive, struggling for life on the cold floor of the laundry room. Her husband, Scott Jones, was in a state of hysteria, pleading with the first responders to save her. "She's my everything," he cried, his voice desperate and panicked. But despite the emergency team's best efforts, Deborah was soon pronounced dead at the hospital. At first glance, it seemed like a terrible accident. Scott told the authorities that Deborah had collapsed while doing laundry and that he had attempted to perform CPR, but something wasn't right. The officers on the scene noticed inconsistencies in his story, hesitations, contradictions, and an almost rehearsed explanation of what had happened. As they questioned him further, his behavior fluctuated between frantic despair and strange defensiveness. It was clear that there was more to this incident than Scott was admitting. When asked whether Deborah had a history of drug use, Scott hesitated before vaguely implying that she smoked something, but couldn't say exactly what. His uncertainty raised red flags. If he had been with his wife for over 20 years, why was he unsure about her habits? And why was he bringing up potential drug use when her injuries told a different story? The first responders had a job to do: save a life if possible, and when that failed, determine what had led to Deborah's death. The police were now taking over the case, and their first priority was to piece together what had happened in the hours leading up to this tragic moment. Deborah and Scott's two children, 17-year-old Mary and 10-year-old son, had been present at the trailer park that day. Now, motherless and shaken, they became the key witnesses to an unfolding investigation. Mary described the day as tense, filled with arguments between her parents. This wasn't unusual. Fights had been a constant in their household. But something about that day had felt different. The arguments were more intense, more desperate. She struggled to remember the exact words exchanged, but she was sure of one thing. Her mother and father had been at odds just before everything fell apart. The family had moved into the trailer park recently, a significant downgrade from their previous home in the mountains, where they had left behind their pets and a life they had built together. To outsiders, the relocation might have seemed temporary, but those who knew the family understood that this move was a sign of deeper troubles, a marriage crumbling under the weight of long-standing tensions. As officers gathered statements, another chilling revelation emerged. A hidden surveillance camera, installed by the trailer park's owner due to recent thefts, had captured crucial moments leading up to Deborah's death. Whatever had happened in that laundry room, it had been recorded, and soon the truth would be laid bare. Scott Jones and Deborah DePinto had been together for 2 decades, but their relationship had been far from a fairy tale. They had met in 1998 at a New Year's Eve party. Scott was 28, Deborah was 25. Their connection was instant, built on a shared love for horses and Colorado's open landscapes. In the early years, they built a life together, with Deborah working tirelessly to provide for their growing family. By 2008, she had settled into a stable career as a chef at the University of Colorado. Scott, on the other hand, had a more sporadic work history, often relying on Deborah's income while he took on the role of caretaker for the children. For years, this imbalance simmered beneath the surface. Scott's lack of consistent employment meant that Deborah was under constant pressure, juggling multiple jobs to keep their family afloat. At times, it seemed like she was supporting not only their children but Scott as well. Over time, resentment grew. By 2014, signs of strain in their marriage were becoming public. That year, Deborah posted a social media update that read, "Relationship status, it's complicated." While it may have seemed like a casual joke to some, those close to her knew it wasn't. The tensions between her and Scott had reached a breaking point. The couple's previous neighbors, who had lived near them in the mountains, had little good to say about Scott. He was described as a man who didn't work, who lingered around bothering others while Deborah worked herself to exhaustion. They spoke highly of her, admiring her work ethic and dedication to her family, but they also recognized that she was being taken advantage of. One former friend of Scott, a man named Gardner, described him as someone who lacked self-control and struggled to keep a job. He also confirmed what others had suspected. Scott and Deborah had been on the verge of separation for years. In fact, at the beginning of June 2018, just weeks before her death, Scott had moved into the trailer alone, allegedly splitting from Deborah. But despite this separation, they continued to cross paths, often leading to fights that had been growing in intensity. The most chilling detail, however, came from those who had heard Scott talk about his marriage in private. When asked what he would do if Deborah ever left him, Scott had a disturbing response. He assured his friend that he wouldn't let it happen. He spoke about violence, making cryptic yet sinister comments about how he would handle it if she ever tried to move on. One particular comment stood out. "If she tries to leave me, I'll whack her over the head and put her in the ground." A week before Deborah's death, Scott made another alarming statement to someone else. He claimed he had friends who owed him favors and could take her out if necessary. These were no longer just empty threats. Scott's jealousy and possessiveness had escalated to a dangerous level, and Deborah was walking straight into its path. The night she died, she had just come home from work, exhausted from another long shift. She likely wanted nothing more than to rest, spend time with her children, and escape the tension that had come to define her relationship with Scott. But instead, she found herself locked in another argument with a man who refused to let her go. This time, the fight wouldn't end with just words. It would end in tragedy. June 18, 2018 was supposed to be an ordinary day. Deborah DePinto had woken up early, like always, to head to her job at the University of Colorado. The trailer park where she and her family had been staying was only meant to be temporary, but the circumstances surrounding their move were anything but simple. What should have been a brief transition had become another burden on Deborah's already exhausted shoulders. By that summer, her marriage to Scott Jones was beyond repair. They had been living separately, and to those around them, it seemed like the final step toward a permanent split. But despite the distance, Scott remained a looming presence in Deborah's life. He still saw the children, still kept in contact, and still found ways to insert himself into her daily routine. The separation had not given her the peace she had hoped for. On that fateful afternoon, Deborah finished her shift and returned to the trailer park. She was tired. She had spent hours on her feet, cooking and preparing meals for others, all while dealing with the constant stress of her home life. The last thing she wanted was another argument. But Scott was waiting. The children were there too. Mary, their teenage daughter, and their 10-year-old son had been at the trailer park when Deborah arrived. Neither of them expected what would unfold that evening. Mary later told police that her parents had been arguing that day. This was nothing new. She had grown up hearing them fight. But this time, something about the tension was different. It wasn't just a disagreement. It felt heavier, more dangerous. The confrontation escalated as Scott followed Deborah into the trailer park office, a small, cramped space that had a laundry room tucked away in the back. It was supposed to be a neutral place, but it quickly became the scene of a nightmare. A hidden surveillance camera, installed by the trailer park's owner after a string of thefts, recorded the final moments leading up to Deborah's death. The footage revealed the disturbing reality of what had taken place. Scott and Deborah entered the office, clearly in the middle of an argument. Their voices were tense, their movements agitated. At one point, Deborah's exhaustion became evident. She wasn't just physically drained, she was emotionally spent. She wanted to end the conversation, to walk away. "I'm done," she said. "We are never going to be together." For Scott, this was the breaking point. The words he had feared most had just been spoken, and he refused to accept them. The camera caught only part of what happened next. The rest occurred out of view inside the laundry room, but the audio remained. Deborah's voice became panicked. She pleaded for him to stop. "Get away from me," she begged. Then, the sounds of a struggle, a choked cry, and then silence. Deborah DePinto had spent her life providing for others. She worked tirelessly to support her family, sacrificing her own happiness for the sake of stability. But on June 18, 2018, in that trailer park laundry room, her life was taken from her by the very person who had once promised to love and protect her. When first responders arrived, Scott was frantic. He shouted for help, his voice filled with panic. "She's my everything. I can't live without her." His hands were shaking, his breath uneven, but beneath the desperation, something felt off. His distress seemed rehearsed, like an act designed to divert attention away from the truth. As paramedics tried to revive Deborah, the police began piecing together the scene. Scott's version of events was shaky. He claimed Deborah had fallen, that she had simply collapsed in the laundry room. He insisted that he had tried to save her, performing CPR until help arrived. But his explanation didn't match the evidence. Deborah's injuries were not consistent with a simple fall. And then there was the surveillance footage, a silent witness to the crime that had taken place. Meanwhile, the children were left to grapple with the unimaginable. Mary and her younger brother had just lost their mother. But that wasn't all. They had also lost the life they once knew. Their father, the man who was supposed to protect them, had just committed the ultimate betrayal. When the police questioned the 10-year-old boy, he recalled the horrifying moment his father ran to him, shouting that his mother wasn't going to make it. "He was screaming," the boy said. "He brought me into the room and she was just purple and cold." Scott had not shielded his son from the horror of what he had done. Instead, he had forced the child to witness it. As investigators worked through the evidence, Scott's past behavior took on an even darker meaning. His possessiveness, his threats, the way he had tried to control Deborah, it all led to this moment. He had warned people before. He had said that if Deborah tried to leave, he would stop her. He had told friends he would whack her over the head and put her in the ground. He had even claimed to have people who owed him favors, people who could make her disappear. And now Deborah was gone. But Scott's arrogance had led to his downfall. The surveillance footage, the witnesses, and the inconsistencies in his story painted a clear picture. This was no accident. This was cold-blooded murder. As officers arrested Scott, he maintained his innocence, still trying to twist the narrative in his favor. But there was no escaping the truth. Deborah DePinto's life had been stolen in an act of senseless violence, and the man responsible would soon face justice. With Deborah DePinto gone, the focus shifted from trying to save her life to seeking justice for her murder. The evidence against Scott Jones was overwhelming. The surveillance footage, the recorded audio, the witness testimonies, and Scott's own contradictory statements painted a clear picture of what had happened in that trailer park laundry room. The Boulder police wasted no time in taking Scott into custody. When confronted with the evidence, he continued to insist that Deborah's death had been an accident. He claimed she had simply fallen, that he had tried to save her, that he had panicked. But his words held no weight against the chilling sounds of the final moments captured on tape. The struggle. Deborah's desperate pleas for him to stop. The sudden silence that followed. Forensic investigators determined that Deborah had died from asphyxiation. She had been strangled. The bruising on her neck, the petechial hemorrhaging in her eyes, and the lack of defensive wounds all indicated that Scott had overpowered her. She had fought, but he had been too strong. The medical examiner ruled her death a homicide, and Scott was charged with murder. As the case moved to trial, Scott's history of controlling behavior and threats became key evidence. Friends, neighbors, and even his own children testified about the volatile relationship between him and Deborah. His past statements about not allowing her to leave, about whacking her over the head and putting her in the ground, about how no restraining order would stop him became damning proof of his intent. This was not a crime of passion. It was premeditated. The most heart-wrenching testimony came from the couple's children. Their 10-year-old son had been forced to witness the aftermath of his mother's death. He had seen her lifeless body. He had heard his father's panic screams. He had been dragged into the chaos, forced to process a reality no child should ever have to face. Mary, too, spoke about the years of tension and fear within their home. The arguments, the threats, the instability, it had all been leading to this moment. The jury did not deliberate long. The evidence was clear. Scott Jones was found guilty of the murder of Deborah DePinto. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would spend the rest of his days behind bars, stripped of the control he had once desperately clung to. But for Deborah's family, justice did not erase the pain. Her children were left without a mother, forced to rebuild their lives in the wake of an unimaginable loss. The people who had loved her, who had worked alongside her, who had seen her smile and laugh and dedicate herself to her family, were left with only memories. Deborah DePinto had been a hardworking, devoted mother. She had tried to escape a toxic relationship to build a better life for herself and her children. But Scott Jones had stolen that future from her. Her story is a tragic reminder of the dangers of domestic violence, a reminder that control, jealousy, and possessiveness can escalate into something far worse, and a reminder that justice, while necessary, can never truly heal the wounds left behind.